One of the things that makes Tower of God such an enjoyable story are all the details that go into building this complex world. As I'm sure you've noticed, there's so many unique concepts that are continuously being introduced, some of which don't even make it to the anime. But there's a few in particular that stand above the rest as ones of recurring importance. Of course, Shinsu is one of them, but another is the concept of the positions, the roles that any individual would take on while participating in a battle. While the anime did briefly mention these positions and their basic purpose, there's definitely a lot more intricacies to each that are worth being explored, especially if you're planning to read on into the webtoon and want to understand what's going on in the battles. So let's go through each of the basic positions and discuss how exactly they work. But first, this video is sponsored by Blade X Lord, a newly released mobile fantasy JRPG brought to life by some of the staff who worked on Final Fantasy and Chrono Trigger. And it really does show that way, both in the type of story that they're trying to present as well as in the fast-paced real-time combat gameplay. Normally when I come across games like these, it's either story or gameplay focused, but Blade X Lord actually does both pretty well. It's easy to pick up, has a decent amount of strategy involved, and is visually aesthetic all at the same time. Not to mention, the story is enjoyably brought together by these well-animated 3D cutscenes all voiced by a proper cast, some of which you may recognize from popular anime. It becomes this massive campaign that will continue to grow with new playable chapters and characters every month. So, if you want to experience this new fantasy JRPG, then go ahead and use the link in the description to start playing Blade X Lord for free today. Now, let's get back to the video. In order to understand the positions, we first need to understand why they're necessary. You see, climbing the tower is usually a team effort. More times than not, battles within the tower are fought between teams. Whether it be during a test or even just a personal dispute, unless you're extremely powerful, you're going to want to take on these events with some allies. It's the most standard method of climbing the tower, and each member of a team is assigned a specific position. Even the names itself originated when King Jihad first climbed the tower with his own team, though when they did it, they weren't fighting other people. They were fighting divine fish like the white steel eels. It's the reason why the positions have aquatic-based names like Fisherman and Wave Controller. Though those names may not be entirely relevant now, they're definitely crucial to fighting nonetheless. Sure, the battles may have changed from person versus fish to person versus person, but the way that they're fought are generally the same. Now, the first important thing to note is that every position requires the manipulation of Shinsu. In fact, it's how you manipulate Shinsu that determines the position that best fits you. It may seem like only Wave Controllers and Fishermen have been doing it, but in actuality, every person who has a position has made a contract with the administrator. This allows them to use Shinsu in accordance with the needs of their position. So, with that as a little bit of context, let's start things off with the Fishermen. Considering that people like Endodasi, Yuri, and Anak fall into this category, it only makes sense that these are your standard DPS. Fishermen are the core combatants of every team. They excel at close to mid-range combat, and as such will always be found at the front line during a battle. In comparison to something like a Wave Controller or Light Bearer, this is a much less technical position. The only job a Fisherman has is to eliminate their opponent with as much destructive power as possible. So, at close range they'll choose to use something like a needle, whereas an ignition weapon like this sword is much less common because of its high surface area. Any weapon with a broad surface becomes much harder to swing in higher densities of Shinsu. That's why we only ever see needles or spears used. Though in close quarters combat, one of the most valuable assets a Fisherman can use is body strengthening, the technique of manipulating the Shinsu around them to reinforce their body. It's the first thing a Fisherman will learn when being taught Shinsu manipulation. Now, at mid-range, a Fisherman would use something more like a reel. It works exactly like how a fishing reel does, except the line attached to the reel is controlled via Shinsu, allowing it to be wound or unwound at the user's discretion to extend the viable range of a needle or hook. During the hide-and-seek test, it was supposed to be a weapon that both Anak and Endodasi used against Quant. In this scene here, Anak tied her green April to the end of her reel, then used it to try and touch Quant's tag. Then Endodasi also did something similar, except she actually succeeded in using her reel to steal Quant's badge when he was distracted. So it's quite clear that a reel is just as important as a needle when it comes to a Fisherman's inventory. Keep in mind though that inventories are a whole separate concept when talking about weapons. For now though, all you need to know is that every position has a unique set of tools that helps them to do their job better. Usually looking at the type of inventory someone has helps to determine what position they are. For example, the ranker we saw during Serena's flashback was likely a fisherman because he had both an arms and an armor inventory, a kit most fitted to a frontline attacker. Next, let's take a look at the position that works closest to the fisherman, the scouts. Unlike the fishermen who are typically armed to the teeth, scouts are more the opposite. They're lightly armed with barely anything so that they can swiftly and quietly move ahead to gather information. It's here that you'd find people like Quant, Shibisu, and Huts. As we've seen with Quant, ideally a scout is very quick, both on their feet and in their head. They have to be capable of moving extremely fast across long distances, plus be ready to react at a moment's notice. Being fast is only half the battle. Scouts must also be skilled at making split-second decisions. What I mean is that traversing into enemy territory isn't something that they can exactly plan for. They must always be ready to encounter the enemy and have a plan for when that happens. Even though the fisherman is the core fighter, the scout will often be the first one to encounter the enemy. What they choose to do after that is completely up to them, and it will often have a significant role in dictating the outcome of the battle. They could retreat, they could continue to gather information, they could flank and coordinate an attack. There's so many options for the scout, which is why their ability to think quickly is such a crucial attribute for them. Shibisu may not seem like the best fighter, but he is very observant and is therefore good at relaying information. This is something that more of a basic scout will do. On the other hand, a combat scout like Huts will focus more on backing up the fisherman. One thing that is common between both types of scouts is that they like darkness. This was briefly hinted at during the hide-and-seek test with Quant. We saw him use a very standard scout technique known as Black Fish. It's a body reinforcement technique that uses Shinsu to block out the light of a lighthouse. By doing that, they've essentially removed the enemy's eyes and have made themselves practically invisible. Scouts also possess a device known as an observer that helps to assist with their reconnaissance. These are basically portable cameras that collect visual data and pass them on to the Lightbearer. It's an effective tool to immediately relay information, all of which goes towards achieving the scout's main goal of collecting data on the overall situation. That data is then handled by what's arguably the most important position on a team, the Lightbearer. Behind every team, there is usually a strategist formulating a plan, someone who oversees the battle without ever having to step into it themselves. This is because the Lightbearer uses a device called a lighthouse to gather, monitor, and control information. It allows them to not only have a solid understanding of the situation around them, but also gives them the ability to directly manage it. It's quite possibly the most useful asset to have on the field. That's why it often becomes a prime target for attack. In a way, the lighthouse can serve as a team's lifeline. It's practically their entire command center. So not only is the Lightbearer responsible for managing information, but they're also expected to defend their lighthouse as well. That's why they can't be useless in combat. If they were, then it'd be like having no defenses on your home base. But what exactly does this lighthouse do anyway? Well, the device itself is a cube that emits light, gathers information, and transmits commands. It's made from an ore called suspendium, a buoyant mineral where the higher the purity, the better it floats in Shinsu. It's for this reason that lighthouses are typically graded based on their purity of suspendium. However, it's not the only device that uses this mineral. Both pockets and inventories use it as well. That's how everything is able to float. Anyway, without getting too much into the logistics of the lighthouse's functionality, one thing actually worth noting is that it runs in units of cubes. The lighthouse itself can be divided into several cubes that can compress or expand into different sizes. So long as one of these cubes is set as the main cube, all the other divisions of it can be set up to do different functions, all of which aid in the gathering of information. One can be set up as a communication hub, while the other is set up as a display monitor and another to record data. It's quite the versatile asset, which is why Lightbearers and their lighthouses are usually as far back from the front line as possible. Well, the ones that focus on creating the strategy are anyway. There does exist a more frontline-focused Lightbearer who uses their cubes to assist in a more direct way. This could be something as simple as generating light via their cubes, or something more hands-on like manipulating Shinsu to amplify the attacks of your fishermen. It could even be both at the same time. Whatever it is, it usually requires an extreme level of Shinsu control due to the sheer amount of multitasking involved. A frontline Lightbearer not only has to gather information and give out instructions, but also take part in the battle itself. They could even be monitoring and assisting in multiple battles at once. That's why their range of Shinsu control has to be large and their tactics on point. Kun is a perfect example of this because he is both very cunning and strong. The way he's able to quickly take in all information, then formulate a successful strategy, is a sign that he possesses one of the most important qualities of a skilled Lightbearer. Being strong on top of that is just a plus. The Lightbearer is definitely one of the more intricate roles that are probably the hardest to fulfill properly. You can be a pretty high-level ranker and still get outclassed by a single highly skilled Lightbearer. That's why the Lightbearer can sometimes become the strongest position on the team, even surpassing that of the Fisherman. Now, the position that's probably the least intricate is the Spearbearer. It's much more simple in terms of responsibilities as they take on more of a long-range support role. As the name implies, the Spearbearer supports the Fisherman by throwing spears from a distance with pinpoint accuracy. At closer ranges, the Spearbearer will often be told to aim for the enemy's weak points, but at longer ranges, it's very much the equivalent to sniping. Their goal is to keep pressure on the enemy team by bombarding them with high-damage long-range attacks. That's pretty much what someone like Rak will do. Finally, we get to the position of Bam, the Wave Controller. This is likely the rarest position to be placed into, even more so than the Lightbearer. The thing about Wave Controllers, though, is that every single one of them fights differently. What classifies them into this position in the first place is their incredible ability to fight with Shinsu. Yes, every position does do this in some way, but it's the Wave Controller that uses Shinsu to its utmost potential. Remember, Shinsu is a substance of infinite possibilities, therefore literally anything can be done with it. So it's likely that every Wave Controller will come to establish their own unique style of fighting with it. Though when it comes to the overall battle, Wave Controllers pretty much fight to achieve a single goal, and that's to shift the tides of the battle into your team's favor. Much like the Spearbearer, they'll often be found on the back lines providing some sort of support from a distance, a type of support that involves anything and everything to do with Shinsu. Whether it be manipulating your opponent's flow of it, or using your own to create bang and strengthen allies, the Wave Controller has the ability to completely dominate the battlefield. Shinsu is by far the most central component of battle, so a Wave Controller who has the ability to manipulate it well will often have the most dominating presence. Imagine someone like Yuga using his abilities to completely deprive your team of Shinsu. Your Fishermen are now significantly weaker, your lighthouses can no longer float. Your scouts can't hide and your Wave Controllers can't fight back. It's a very extreme case, but if the power difference is that high, then it's entirely possible. Just like Shinsu, the Wave Controller has countless options when it comes to battle. It's just a matter of determining what's best for the situation. That being said, the most common technique that almost every Wave Controller will use is called the Bang. It's the very first thing that they'll learn how to do since it's pretty much a measure of how skilled a Wave Controller you are. Reason being that creating a single bang requires extreme levels of Shinsu control, so much so that learning how to create just one is said to take over 4 years. So the fact that Bam only took 2 weeks to do it himself is a rather phenomenal feat that really goes to highlight his overall potential with Shinsu. Of course there's more to Bang like its size and consistency, both of which go towards determining how strong it is as an attack. But that's more related to Shinsu itself than it is to the actual Wave Controller position. So perhaps Shinsu could be a topic for another video. Anyway, that's pretty much what the Wave Controller does and can do. It is, however, important to note that just because Wave Controllers specialize in Shinsu manipulation, doesn't mean that they're necessarily the best Shinsu user. As I said earlier, every position can use Shinsu. It's just a matter of how that Shinsu is used that determines the position you're placed in. For example, Anuk and Endodisi are currently the best Shinsu users out of the regulars. But that doesn't mean that they'll make for good Wave Controllers. There are, however, certain cases where a single person can take on multiple positions. There's no rule that says you can't specialize in more than one. Hats is a good example of someone who could fit both the Fisherman and Scout role, and Shibisu would do fine as a Lightbearer as well. So it's not like once your position is determined that you're stuck in that role forever. I'm sure it also goes without saying that it's very useful for teams to combine the techniques of different positions together. Most notably when a Lightbearer combines their support with a Spearbearer or Wave Controller. But that's getting into some territory that we haven't yet seen in the anime. It would mean that we also have to talk about the other positions aside from the basic 5. Special positions more tailored to a specific individual and their unique powers. Once again though, that'll be a topic for another day. Anyway, that's everything on the positions and their responsibilities. I wouldn't say that any single team comp is better than the other, but I can speculate on what an ideal one would be. Given that teams are most often 8 people or less, my guess would have to be 2 scouts, 2 fishermen, 1 wave controller, 1 spear bearer, and 2 light bearers. The reason I would have 2 light bearers is so that I could have one focused on strategizing while the other would be a frontline support. That's just my opinion though. Let me know in the comments what team comp that you'd think would be the best. And if you've read the webtoon, then go ahead and drop some names as to who you'd think you'd want in each position. Now, before I go, I'd like to thank Blade X Lord once again for sponsoring this video. If you're looking for a new JRPG with solid gameplay and a lengthy story, then Blade X Lord is probably worth checking out. So feel free to use the link in the description to start playing for free today. Now, as always, thank you so much for watching, and if you enjoyed this type of anime content, then you already know what to do. So, until next time, ciao!